Most people assume the Bible has nothing to say about manipulation, control, or the slow destruction of someone's sense of reality. They've never read 2 Timothy chapter 3. It was written nearly 2,000 years ago by a man sitting in a Roman prison, addressing a young pastor named Timothy about something he called the perilous times of the last days. The Apostle Paul wasn't using the language of modern psychology, but if you place his words in 2 Timothy chapter 3 side by side with what researchers now identify as narcissistic personality patterns, something deeply unsettling becomes impossible to ignore. The overlap isn't approximate, it is exact. And for those who have lived inside a relationship defined by manipulation, control, and the slow erosion of their sense of reality, reading Paul's words through this lens doesn't just feel intellectually interesting, it feels like being seen for the first time by someone who understood, centuries before the terminology existed, exactly what you were dealing with. This matters because many Christians who have been harmed by narcissistic people struggle with a particular kind of confusion that others don't face. You were taught to forgive. You were taught to believe the best. You were taught that love is patient and endures all things. And so when someone used those very teachings as leverage against you, demanding your silence, your endurance, your endless grace, you stayed longer than you should have. You questioned yourself more than the situation warranted. You wondered whether your desire to leave was a failure of faith rather than an act of wisdom. Paul's warning, written to a community of believers facing exactly this kind of person, offers something profound. The scriptures not only describe these patterns, they command a response to them. Understanding what Paul saw, and what we now understand through the lens of psychology, can give you something that manipulation was designed to take from you: clarity. There are 7 specific behaviors Paul identifies in 2 Timothy 3, 1-5 that align with what clinicians now describe as narcissistic patterns. Each one has a name in the behavioral sciences. Each one has a face you may already recognize. And each one, when you understand it clearly, loses a measure of the power it once had over you. The first thing Paul identifies is this: people who are lovers of themselves above all else. The original Greek word he uses is philautos, a compound of the words for love and self, describing not ordinary self-care or healthy self-regard, but a consuming orientation toward the self that crowds out genuine concern for anyone else. For the Apostle Paul, this wasn't a personality quirk. It was the root from which every other destructive behavior in his list would grow. Clinical researchers have observed the same thing. What appears on the surface as confidence, charm, and self-assurance in narcissistic individuals is often rooted in something far more fragile, a self that cannot tolerate being questioned, challenged, or seen as ordinary. The admiration they seek from others isn't the natural desire for connection. It functions as a kind of psychological oxygen. Without it, something beneath the surface begins to collapse. This is why the relationship with a narcissistic person can feel strangely consuming from the very beginning. The attention they require isn't something you eventually stop noticing. It shapes the entire atmosphere of the relationship, pulling your focus, your energy, and eventually your sense of self into orbit around theirs. Paul saw the spiritual signature of this pattern clearly. When the self becomes the organizing center of a person's life, everything else, including other people, gets measured by what it provides to that center. That is not love, it is consumption. The second behavior Paul names flows directly from the first: the pattern of being boastful and proud. These may sound like simple character flaws, the kind of thing you'd attribute to someone who talks too much about their accomplishments at a dinner party. But what Paul is describing, and what behavioral researchers confirm, is something structurally different. C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, called pride the anti-God state of mind, observing that it is essentially competitive in nature. A person with genuine pride does not simply want things, they want to have more than others, to be above others, to be recognized as superior. That competitive, hierarchical orientation is precisely what clinicians identify at the core of narcissistic patterns. Grandiosity, the clinical term, isn't necessarily loud. It doesn't always announce itself in obvious boasting. Sometimes it operates quietly, through the subtle devaluation of your accomplishments. The way a compliment from them always seems to contain a caveat. The way your success is met not with celebration, but with a shift in their mood that you eventually learn to manage by making yourself smaller. The boasting and pride Paul warned about wasn't just about what someone says. It was about a posture toward other people that places them perpetually below. When you lived inside that dynamic, you likely felt it before you could name it. The persistent sense that no matter what you achieved, something in the relationship required you to diminish it. The third cluster Paul describes is one of the most psychologically complex, being disobedient to parents, ungrateful, and unholy. Taken individually, these might seem like a disconnected list. Understood together through the lens of what researchers now call the entitlement cluster, they reveal something coherent and important. Narcissistic entitlement is the deeply held belief, often unconscious, often defended with fierce emotional intensity, that the normal rules of reciprocity do not apply to them. They receive without acknowledging. They take without returning. They benefit from the effort, sacrifice, and emotional labor of others, while treating that labor as something they are simply owed. The reason this makes those with genuinely good hearts particularly vulnerable is that grace-based people, those who believe in forgiveness, second chances, and assuming the best in others, tend to interpret this pattern through the most charitable possible lens for far longer than is healthy. When someone takes without giving, you assume they're going through something difficult. When someone doesn't acknowledge your sacrifice, you tell yourself they must not have realized. When someone treats your love as guaranteed, you redouble your effort, convinced that more generosity will eventually reach them. Paul's warning, and the research behind it, suggests a different interpretation. What looks like someone who hasn't yet learned to be grateful may actually be someone who has no structural motivation to become grateful, because their entire relational framework is built on the assumption that your care is their entitlement. This is not a wound you can love someone out of. It is a pattern that requires recognition, not more accommodation. If you've recognized yourself in what's been described so far, if you've felt the weight of loving someone whose self-focus consumed the relationship, whose pride quietly diminished your worth, whose entitlement made your sacrifice feel invisible, I want you to pause here and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me, when was the first moment you realized that your kindness was being treated as a resource rather than a gift? Your words might be the thing that helps someone else finally understand what they've been living through. The fourth behavior Paul names is perhaps the one that causes the deepest psychological damage: being without love and unforgiving. The Greek word translated here as without love is astorgos, which refers specifically to the absence of natural family affection, the kind of bond that most human beings form instinctively with those closest to them. And unforgiving in the original carries the weight of someone who holds grievances not as a passing emotional response, but as a strategic position. These two qualities together describe something that researchers in interpersonal psychology have documented extensively: the combination of emotional coldness with the weaponization of perceived offenses. A person without natural warmth toward those who love them most, combined with an extraordinary memory for any slight, any boundary you enforced, any moment when you failed to meet their expectations, that combination creates a relational environment that is deeply destabilizing. Because the rules are asymmetrical, your mistakes are cataloged and retrieved. Their behavior requires your ongoing forgiveness, your reset, your refusal to keep score. But the moment you draw a boundary, assert a need, or fail to provide what they expected, that becomes evidence to be used against you. Clinicians describe this as blame shifting, the rapid redirection of accountability away from themselves and onto you, and gaslighting, the systematic undermining of your confidence in your own memory and perception of events. Paul saw the spiritual root of both. A person who is without love and unforgiving has constructed a relational framework where their own comfort is protected at all costs, and where the person closest to them bears the weight of that protection. Living inside that framework for years leaves a particular kind of damage, not just in the relationship, but in your ability to trust your own judgment. The fifth pattern Paul identifies extends this further: being slanderous and without self-control. In the context of narcissistic behavior, these two qualities describe what happens when the relationship is threatened, either by your growing awareness, your increasing resistance to their patterns, or the possibility that you might leave. The slander is rarely random. It is targeted and strategic. Researchers who study narcissistic relationship dynamics have documented the phenomenon of the preemptive smear campaign, the process by which a narcissistic person, sensing that accountability is approaching, begins shaping the narrative among mutual friends, family members, and community before you have the opportunity to share your experience. They don't always lie outright. They select true details, arrange them without context, and frame them in ways that position themselves as the reasonable, wounded party, and you as the unstable, ungrateful, or difficult one. By the time you realize what has happened, people who once trusted you are uncertain. The community that might have supported you is already holding a different version of the story. And the without self-control Paul mentions is visible in how disproportionate their response becomes when their image is threatened. The intensity of the anger, the relentlessness of the attack, the willingness to cause visible damage rather than risk being exposed. What looks like emotional volatility has a precise function. It is a weapon designed to make you stop pursuing accountability. The sixth behavior in Paul's list is being brutal and hating what is good. These are strong words, and they describe something that takes time to recognize because it is not always visible in the early stages of a relationship with a narcissistic person. The brutality Paul refers to isn't necessarily physical. It manifests in the willingness to cause psychological pain without remorse, the cutting remark delivered with precision, the cold withdrawal timed to maximize your anxiety, the exposure of your vulnerabilities in contexts where they can do the most damage. And the hating what is good is something that survivors often describe in retrospect with a particular kind of grief. The more you grew, the more threatened they became. The better you did, the more hostile the environment became. Your healing wasn't celebrated, it was perceived as a threat. Researchers in this field note that narcissistic individuals often experience the genuine well-being of those close to them as a kind of narcissistic injury, a wound to their sense of superiority. Your growth reminds them of what they cannot tolerate examining in themselves, and rather than allowing that recognition to produce humility, they move to suppress the thing that exposed it. That means suppressing you. The seventh pattern Paul identifies is the most disturbing of all, and it is the one he specifically commands believers to respond to with decisive action. He describes people who have a form of godliness but deny its power. Read that slowly, because Paul is not describing people outside the church. He is describing people inside it. People who hold the vocabulary of faith, who attend the gatherings, who speak the language of grace and humility and surrender, but in whom the actual transforming power of genuine relationship with God is absent. The mask of religion worn over a structure that remains fundamentally self-serving. Theologian John MacArthur, in his commentary on this passage, observes that this is the most dangerous spiritual deception in Paul's list, precisely because it has external credibility. It can pass inspection. It can be persuasive. It knows exactly what a spiritually healthy person sounds like, and it reproduces that sound with enough accuracy to create genuine confusion in those who genuinely love God and want to believe the best about those who claim to as well. Clinicians who study religious communities have documented what is now understood as spiritual abuse, the use of scripture, theological authority, or spiritual language to manipulate, control, and silence those in close relationship with a narcissistic person. The abuser doesn't quote the Bible to edify, they quote it to shut you down. They invoke forgiveness not because they understand grace, but because they understand that your belief in grace can be used to prevent accountability. They use the language of spiritual authority to reinforce control, to reframe your legitimate resistance as rebellion, and to position their behavior as something God requires you to accept. Paul's response to this particular kind of person is unambiguous. He does not say to engage them with more patience, more evidence, or more theological argument. He says, have nothing to do with them. The Greek imperative he uses, apotropou, carries the weight of turning away firmly, a decisive act of separation. Not hatred, not revenge, wisdom. What Paul understood, and what 2 millennia of human experience confirm, is that there is a category of person whose patterns will not change through your greater generosity, your more careful explanation, or your more sincere forgiveness. Not because change is impossible, with God nothing is impossible, but because change requires a level of honest self-examination that these patterns are specifically designed to prevent. The entire architecture of narcissistic behavior, as researchers describe it, is built around the avoidance of shame. Every tactic, the denial, the blame shifting, the rewriting of history, the projection, the smear campaign, the performance of victimhood, serves the same underlying function: to keep a fragile self-image from having to encounter the truth about itself. When your continued presence, your forgiveness, and your grace can be absorbed without producing the discomfort that might lead to genuine reflection, you have not helped them. You have, however unwittingly, removed the one thing that might. The most loving thing you can do, for yourself and, in a real sense, for them, may be exactly what Paul commanded: to create a firm, clear separation. For many Christians, that command feels like it requires permission it was never supposed to require. You've wondered whether protecting yourself is selfish. You've questioned whether drawing a line means you haven't forgiven. You've worried that removing yourself from the relationship contradicts the call to love without limits. Paul's letter addresses this directly, not through lengthy theological argument, but through the clarity of a man who had been betrayed, abandoned, slandered, and harmed by people who claimed to be in the same community of faith, and who had learned that, not despite his faith, but through it, that wisdom sometimes looks like walking away. Forgiveness is real. Forgiveness is required. Forgiveness does not require you to remain in proximity to what harmed you. You can release someone before God and simultaneously refuse to continue providing them access to your life, your peace, and your sense of reality. Those two things are not in contradiction. They are both acts of obedience. The healing that comes after a relationship like this is not fast, and it is not simple, but it follows a recognizable path. The confusion lifts as you begin trusting your own perceptions again, perceptions that were systematically undermined for months or years. The self-doubt decreases as you create distance from the voice that told you your needs were excessive, your boundaries were cruel, and your desire for reciprocity was a character flaw. The grief is real because what you lost was not only a relationship, but a version of what you hoped the relationship could become. Grieving that is not weakness, it is honesty. And from that honesty, something begins to grow that the relationship was never able to sustain. A sense of your own worth that does not depend on someone else's willingness to acknowledge it. You were not naive for loving deeply. You were not foolish for believing the best. You were not wrong for staying as long as you tried. The qualities that made you a target, your capacity for empathy, your commitment to grace, your willingness to endure difficulty for the sake of someone you loved, are not the things that failed you. They are the things that will carry you forward. The Apostle Paul, writing to a young man who was also trying to shepherd a community through exactly these kinds of relationships, did not tell him to become harder, more suspicious, or less loving. He told him to see clearly. Clarity is not cynicism. Clarity is the beginning of genuine freedom. If this reflection has helped bring language to something you've been carrying, I want to hear from you. Share this video with someone who needs it, and leave a comment below. Where are you in your healing right now? Whether you're still in the middle of it or you finally found solid ground, your story matters, and you don't have to carry it alone. The greatest victory in surviving a relationship shaped by the patterns Paul described is not the moment they finally admit what they did. Most of the time, that moment never comes, and waiting for it only extends the harm. The greatest victory is the moment you no longer need it to. The moment your peace is no longer held hostage to their acknowledgement. The moment you understand that your healing is possible, not when they change, but when you finally see clearly enough to stop asking them to. Paul knew that. The scriptures have always known that. And now, so do you.